Well, welcome and good evening. It's so wonderful to see a full room of listeners and learners, and to see such a vibrant community ready to engage a really important conversation. Welcome to all of you to the King's University, and to those of you joining us online. Do I need to do something, Jonathan?
No, keep talking. I'll figure it. Just keep going. I'll make it work.
Okay. My name is Jonathan Nikolai de Koning, and I have the privilege of serving here at the King's University as the program director of the Micah Centre, the King's Justice and Reconciliation Education Center. So on behalf of King's and the Micah Centre, I am so glad to welcome all of you to this community. When we heard here at King's that Dr. Sylvia Keesmaat would be visiting our city in January of all times to visit this place, we jumped at the chance to have her join us for the evening. If you're going to come all of this way in the dead of winter, you might as well make the most of it. And so here we are, to have Dr. Keesmaat lead us in reflecting on the lament of the land and the tears of God. An evening of personal and theological reflection on the creation, our grief, and God's grief at its destruction, and our faithful response. Before we begin, I want to say a word of thanks to the DeGroot family, who established the DeGroot Memorial Lecture Fund at the Micah Centre some years ago to help make events like this possible. The DeGroot Memorial Lecture Fund was started in memory of Peter and Tina DeGroot, who believed that Christian education could help make the world a more just and humane place for all. Dr. Keesmaat's reflections and our panelists' responses tonight will be, I think, in keeping with the spirit of that gift. As we begin today, I would like to acknowledge the land and the peoples who are our hosts. Amisquachi Waskahigan, Edmonton, is located where the prairie and boreal forest meet, a gathering place and home for many Indigenous peoples since time immemorial, including the Nehiwa, the Niitsitapi, the Tsuut'ina, and the Michippi peoples. King's was founded by newcomers and settlers in this land who immigrated from the Netherlands, and has since grown to welcome students and staff from many places and cultures. We are grateful, all of us, to be able to gather here today. We also acknowledge that this is Treaty 6 territory and part of the Métis homeland, and that we, all of us, by our presence here, have entered into relationship with the original peoples of this land. We look forward to continuing to learn how we at King's can be good neighbors with all of our relations in creation. We at the Micah Centre are committed to being a people of reconciliation with the land and reparations with the people of this land. I think part of learning what it is to become good neighbors with all of our relations in creation is, to use the words of one theologian, daring to turn what is happening to the world into our own personal suffering. And Dr. Keesmaat is one biblical scholar who can help us do just that in ways that are faithful to the biblical story. So our evening is going to proceed in the following way. Dr. Sylvia Keesmaat will offer her presentation, The Lament of the Land and the Tears of God. And afterwards, Dr. John Hiemstra will host a panel of responses from Céline, Jonathan, and Gerda before we move into a time of more open conversation between Dr. Keesmaat and our panelists. John Hiemstra is Professor Emeritus of Political Science here at King's, whose many years of teaching and research often explored the responsibilities of the Christian community and the wider society to the rest of creation, especially here in Alberta. Dr. Hiemstra will introduce the panel a little bit later. And now to Dr. Sylvia Keesmaat. Dr. Sylvia Keesmaat is a biblical scholar, activist, and a farmer. Sylvia is the co-author with Brian Walsh of Romans Disarmed, Resisting Empire, Demanding Justice from 2019, and Colossians Remixed, Subverting the Empire from 2004. Two books that I continue to find very helpful in my own seeking justice and now in my teaching here at King's. She is also the author of Paul and His Story, Reinterpreting the Exodus Tradition. Sylvia founded her online teaching platform, Bible Remixed, in 2021 to help nurture a community of Jesus followers who are deeply rooted in the biblical story and who are becoming a community of welcome, healing, and nurture for those people and creatures who suffer most from the violence of our world. She offers online courses throughout the year that are open to all on a pay-what-you-can basis. So you can go to her website, Bible Remixed, to learn more about those courses. And, especially interesting, from 2016 to 2023, Sylvia held an heirloom tomato seedling sale every spring on her farm. Sylvia lives at Russet House Farm, an off-grid permaculture farm with her husband, Brian Walsh, and a fluctuating number of people and animals. Welcome, Dr. Keesmaat, and thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's always a pleasure to be at King's. It always feels a little bit like a reunion. Last time I was here, I was introduced by my student, Neil DeRue, who I was sorry to find out is no longer here. And tonight, John Hiemstra, who's moderating this, is an old friend. Gerda, who's responding, is a child, and I knew as a child when she was a child, so I'm starting to feel old. And there's so many other people I know in the audience. But what I also love about coming to King's is meeting new people in the community. So I'm looking forward to hearing Jonathan and Céline and interacting with them later this evening. So, increasingly, as I speak with people about the climate crisis that we're now facing in our lives, people describe feelings of grief and anxiety. And it seems to me there's a number of reasons why we feel this grief. One is we grieve the loss of the places we love. So many of us go to the places that we grew up, our first geographies, and those places are no longer there, or they've been covered over by development. And I think the fact that many of us are just now experiencing that grief says something about the privilege that many of us have. Because for many people, this grief has been generational. For Indigenous peoples on our lands, for people who are refugees who have been forced to leave the places that they love. When I think of my own family and my own mom coming to Canada because her parents wanted to come and grieving the loss of the places that she grew up in. War prompts the loss of land and that grief that it brings with it. So there are many of us around the world who grieve the loss of the places that we love. But we also grieve, secondly, the loss of the future that we had hoped for. I mean, we're creatures who think ahead, right? Sometimes with anticipation, sometimes with dread. And what happens when we feel little scope for anticipation? When thinking of the future does not bring visions of a safe home or a land that's producing abundantly, of enough food on the table, of children and grandchildren who are safe and healthy, able to thrive and grow in the world, we had hoped for a future that would be a place where our communities could flourish, where healing might come, where justice might finally result in peace. But instead, we see a future of increasing loss of habitat, loss of biodiversity, loss of affordable housing, unbearable temperatures. All of that weds us to anxiety about the future. And so we grieve the loss of the future we had hoped for. But we also, this is thirdly, grieve the loss of our connection to creation. It used to be that those who did not have access outdoor spaces, to the nourishing embrace of trees, to the wild freedom of rivers and lakes, the encouraging sound of bird song, or the reassuring drone of pollinating insects. It used to be that the people who didn't have access to that were people who were confined to urban centers. But now, many people who live outside of urban centers deliberately are not interacting with creation, are disconnected from creation due to the requirements of work or the character of education, and increasingly by choice. And all of this means that not only do we lose our interactions with our human neighbors, we also interact less with our non-human neighbors, with plants and trees and animals and insects, rocks and mosses, birds and snakes, and the frogs that live in our neighborhoods. These connections are meant to nourish us. We were meant to have a lifelong engagement with a beautiful and strange otherness, one author says. The ways of other creatures were integral not only to our survival, but to the shaping of our very souls. So what happens when this deep interaction with the wild other is lost to us? When our bodies are no longer shaped by the cold of the wind, or the need to tread softly or run swiftly, when we no longer encounter with breathtaking awe the red-belted bumblebee next to the well. I first saw one of these just last year on my farm, and I was so excited. Or the northern water thrush shyly bobbing on the edge of the pond. We carry the grief of that loss deep within our being, even if we don't know it. We grieve over the loss of our connection to creation. And we grieve, fourthly, our complicity in these losses. All of these griefs are intensified when we ponder our own role in creation's demise. We carry guilt and remorse for the choices we have made that have threatened ecosystems and caused death. We lament the dreams we had for our place in creation and the way we abandon those dreams. And we also grieve our entanglement in the systems and structures that shape our culture, the economic and political and social dynamics that we often have so little control over, and which force us, often unwillingly, onto paths of injustice and oppression and death. Such powerlessness and our complicity can only give rise to deep grief and lament. And fifthly, we're drawn also into the sorrow of creation, and that causes us to grieve. All of these griefs culminate in the sorrow over the suffering of creation. Even if we're not aware of it, we are so intimately connected to the earth, the trees and the plants and the animals that nourish us, that the sorrow of the forests and the ash trees and the wolves, the lakes and the eroded earth itself shapes us. Francis Weller suggests that the sorrow of creation is actually weeping through us. Maybe this is why so many people are suffering from anxiety in our world. What is the appropriate response when faced with destruction, with this violence on such a large scale? Well, Weller says, Francis Weller, who has written a book on grief, says it's essential that we stop and recognize these losses. It's good manners to respond with sorrow, outrage, and apology at these places touched by so much loss. So that's just a way of saying that we're moved to compassion for our creaturely neighbors, for the land and the rocks and the forests. And so doing, we carry the grief of the earth. We carry its sorrow. Now, Paul in Romans 8, which will not be the text I focus on this evening, he describes this grief when he says that the whole creation is groaning in birth pangs. And not only creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we wait for adoption, the redemption of our bodies. That's resurrection language there, the resurrection of our bodies. And this language of grief that I've just been outlining would not have been surprising to anyone in the Roman community to which Paul wrote. The destruction of the forests, the erosion of mountains, the increasing infertility of farmland, the overwhelming number of animals killed in gladiatorial games. All of this was evident to everybody in the Roman Empire. Authors wrote about the environmental destruction happening at that time. What may have been surprising is that the groaning of creation is echoed in the groaning of this Christian community. And later on, verse 26 of Romans 8, in the groaning of the Spirit who intercedes with God, who brings our concerns to God. Now, for those steeped in Paul's scriptures, the grief of both the land and the Creator would have been nothing new. For that grief stretches back almost to the start of the story. And that's what we're going to focus on this evening. There is a short statement at the outset of the flood narrative in Genesis 6 that is breathtaking in its simplicity. The Lord saw that the evil of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of their hearts was only evil continually. Just think about how that piles on. Every inclination of their hearts was only evil continually. Not something you ever want to say to your children. And the Lord regretted, it says, making the human, or the earth creature, on the earth, and was heartsick with grief. The delight of the story of Genesis 1 has not been realized. The exclamation of joy that's woven throughout Genesis 1, the Creator's evident and ongoing excitement every day at the rich diversity of sights and sounds and smells, that 12, 12, 12, it is good, it is good, it is good, has instead turned to grief, regret, and sorrow. And such a turn, of course, began in the garden when that first couple engaged in a radical culinary indiscretion by eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They saw, the text says, and they took. They took what they wanted and they ate. A Hebrew word for took is echoed in the prelude to the flood story in Genesis 6:2, where there are men described as those who took, probably they didn't take them like this, whichever women, as many women as they wanted. The overtones of male violence are clear. It's no wonder then that the story then goes on to describe the children from such violent family systems as the heroes of old, the warriors of renown. Genesis 6, verse 4. Now, for those of us, and I say us because I was too, raised on stories of male saviors, phrases like heroes and warriors are thrilling, evoking knights and battle, honor and bravery, daring deeds and quests for valor. In the Harry Potter's book, what is the best house? Gryffindor, because they're daring and brave, right? I, by the way, would be a Ravenclaw, so I don't buy that. But let us not be deceived by the romantic language here. For the vast majority of people throughout history, heroes and warriors are the ones who destroy families, rape women, capture and enslave innocent people, and pressure the powerless into armed warfare. They are the ones whose legacy is fear and heartbreak, not harmony and flourishing. It's clear that for the Creator, these heroes and warriors are the problem, because their presence meant, in the very next verse, that the Lord saw the injustice of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of their heart was only evil continually. We can't separate that sentence from the previous sentence about violence. So it's no coincidence that the warlords, whose currency was violence and power, created violence in the earth. The linking of war, violence, and creational destruction has been constant throughout history. Just take a look at what's going on now in Gaza and the West Bank, and in the Ukraine, and in Sudan. Such violence on the earth is described a few verses later in this way. The earth was ruined in front of God's very face and was being filled with violence. And God saw that the earth was ruined. For the way of all flesh, that all flesh was living, ruined the earth. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh is imminent, for all flesh has created violence on the earth. I'm going to ruin them along with the earth. Genesis 6:11. Imagine it. This wonderful world of diversity and richness has been gutted. The abundance of creation has become a scarcity. The creatures who lived in the trees are now homeless. The streams are polluted. The earth is no longer fertile. I'm talking about then, not now, but it obtains now. Oddly enough, this sense of destruction has been blunted by the common translation that God saw the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. That's ruined works better for our purposes, and it's more accurate. The repetition of the word ruined in the above verse makes clear the dynamic of the flood. The earth has already been ruined, and as a result, the Creator will extend that ruin to those who have destroyed the earth in the first place. Another translation might be, because they have destroyed the earth, I will destroy them. The flood then is both caused by a climate catastrophe and is a response to a climate catastrophe. Ruin leads to ruin. Destruction leads to destruction. The flood is indeed a judgment, but it unfolds out of a situation that the people are already in. The Creator doesn't impose judgment, but rather lets it unfold out of the consequences of disobedience. And remember the care that the Creator has taken in calling forth this wonderful, interconnected world where there would be a home for every creature, a home for the earth creatures, human beings. I say it that way because we are Adam from Adamah, earth creature from the earth. Our name, Adam, is rooted in the name for the earth, Adamah. So this is a home for the creatures, the earth creatures, and God's very self. And now the Creator's heart is full of sorrow. The world that had so beautifully sprung to life was full of violence. The Creator's not just grieving because the earth has been ruined. Like an artist might be distressed if someone had smashed a beautiful sculpture they'd made. No, the Creator has also entered into the suffering and sorrow of the earth itself. The regret the Creator feels is not just because of creational destruction, but is a heartache that enters into the pain of creation. That's that fifth kind of grief that I said we bear. We bear the sorrow of creation. That's because God bears the sorrow of creation. And here's the lament of the earth. God suffers with the suffering earth. And in the midst of this, the Creator agonizes over restoration. How could healing come again? How could the toxic waters be cleansed? The barren landscapes be reforested? How could the salmon return to the rivers and the wild rice return to the lakes? Could cleansing bring restoration? Would destroying those who enact violence on the earth bring healing? Could ruin and violence simply be washed away so that creation could begin anew? And how would newness come? Perhaps the family of Noah, his wife, sons, and their wives could be the new image bearers, the ones who would observe and serve creation during the judgment of the waters, so that they would know how to live in harmony with other creatures when it's time to start anew on the earth. This is a plan of judgment, yes, but also a plan to birth newness out of destruction. And so the waters cover the earth, and all life that did not enter the ark is destroyed. And we don't know what the Creator experienced when all of creation was wiped out. Was there a point when the Creator realized that the destruction was too much to bear? Was there a point when the Creator entered into the overwhelming grief for the vibrant, colorful, chattering, singing, aromatic richness of the earth? Was it when the forests were covered? Was it when the last animal sank beneath the waves? Was this why the Creator made a promise to refrain from such destruction? From doing it ever again? In Exodus 8:21, God said in God's heart, second time we get God's heart in the story, I will never again curse the earth because of the earth creature. Even though the inclination of the human heart is evil almost from youth, nor will I ever destroy, is evil from youth, nor will I ever destroy every living creature as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. It's clear that nothing has changed on the part of humans. The inclination of the human heart is still evil from youth. So did the promise of never again arise out of anguished grief? We do not know, but we do know this. For the Creator, the grief of the violence done to the earth was not healed with earth's destruction. We know this because we see the Creator's continued lament over the destruction of the earth throughout the Hebrew Bible and into the New Testament.
We see it in the prophets, Hosea 4, Jeremiah 9, Jeremiah 4, Jeremiah 12. We see it in Romans 8. We know this because the Creator's very Spirit is groaning with the earth in Romans 8. And we also know this, that in spite of such grief, the Creator promised in the flood story that from now on, even in the midst of violence, the flourishing of the creatures, the flourishing of creation will be where God's best efforts are directed. For God makes covenant not just with the people who survived the ark, but also with every living thing, along with the earth itself, to never again destroy every living thing in the waters of the flood. This is in Genesis 9. Let me say this again. This is a covenant made not just with human beings, but with all creatures on the earth. The winged creatures, the crawling creatures, the six-legged, the four-legged, the plants with fruit, the plants with seeds. You know, I was raised a good Calvinist, and I was taught the first covenant was with Abraham. So imagine my surprise to discover, reading the biblical text, that the first covenant is with all living creatures and with the earth. It's not about people. The Creator establishes a covenant relationship with them all, and also with the rocks and riverbeds, streams and mountains, all in covenantal relationship with the Creator. And just to root this point even deeper, the word covenant in relation to the earth and all living things is repeated 7 times in Genesis chapter 9. If we know anything about numbers in the Bible, 7 means that's as full as you can get, right? With this promise, God commits to creation forever. So let's be clear. This is a promise that will cause the Creator continued grief, for God has no illusions about this relationship. The Creator knows how bad it can get. The Creator knows that human beings have an inability to control their appetites. We like to take, which is why constraints are put on the eating of meat after the flood in Genesis 9. And the Creator knows that these appetites will lead to species extinction, erosion, drought, and unjust land grabs, all of those things described in the Hebrew Bible. And even so, knowing this, the Creator makes this commitment. The Creator commits to more suffering and to practice restraint in the face of that suffering for the sake of the life of creation. This is a commitment that is marked by betrayal and so will be costly. But the Creator so deeply wants to create a home for all creatures, for the earth and for God's very self, that the Creator is willing to hope that a new future might be possible for all in relationship together. And this new relationship, of course, is symbolized by the hanging of a rainbow in the sky, which is a reminder to God that the relationship has shifted. And the word for bow in Hebrew, as in English, denoted a weapon, right? The bow, I'm pulling open a bow here, that the arrow flies from. But God isn't pulling that bow. God is hanging that weapon up in the sky. Weapons of destruction are hung up for good, no longer to be used. And so God commits to refusing to act in the very ways that God was condemning. The warriors of old relied on the bow in their spread of violence that ruined the earth. And in hanging up the bow, God commits to never ruin the earth again. Violence is never the answer to violence. Now, there are two threads of grace and hope that weave their way through this narrative. And the first is easy to miss if you're reading the text in translation, which many of us in this room are. Noah's name literally means rest, linking Noah's name back to the seventh day of creation, when God rested and took delight in creation. So for the ancient hearers of this story, Noah's very name promises a future of hope, of possible delight in creation once again. But Noah also embodies hope as the one who found grace in Genesis 6:8. A hope of grace is built into this story from the outset, linked to the one who practices a stubborn hope in the face of destruction. That might be an understatement of what Noah did in building the ark, practicing stubborn hope. Crazy hope, weird hope, completely unrealistic about the future hope. Such hope is rooted in God's plan for the continuation of life and the faith that Noah and his wife and sons and their wives have in it. They listen to what God has told them to do, and they carry it out, no matter how impossible or improbable it seems. The second thread of hope that weaves its way throughout the text happens on the ark during the flood itself, as Noah and his wife and family end up having a crash course in their calling as the ones who were to serve and observe creation. In the midst of their grief and their sorrow, and that would be a whole other paper to talk about the sorrow that they have over what is happening. In the midst of their deep longing for the places that they had lost and the communities they had lost, Noah's family knew that being rooted in the earth meant caring for the creatures of the earth. So in the midst of their own pain, they immersed themselves in the task at hand. In the ark, they were united in feeding the hungry and binding up the broken creatures and cleaning out the spaces that had become home for the winged ones and the four-legged ones. They were seeking the lost and the escaped before they were devoured by other creatures. I live on a farm, so I'm speaking from experience with some of these things. In all of this, in this place, all were vulnerable, all needed to be served. And I suspect that gradually their sorrow was pierced by moments of joy, because while death lay outside the walls of the ark, birth soon began to happen within. Shrill open mouths, small furry babies' bodies, knock-kneed creatures stumbling for an udder, life exploding all around. And with birth came knowledge. This is what each creature needs. This is what happens in the secret places of the forest, at the edges of the meadow, in the tops of the trees. This is what we lose when the forest disappears, when the hedgerows are cut down. Each day their grief was held in acts of service and hope, in the daily rhythm of ensuring that life continued. They were fulfilling the ancient call to observe and serve creation. That's how I translate till and keep creation. Being called back to their true role as servants of creation. So the ark then was not only a place of safety and nurture that would make resurrection possible, the ark was also a place of learning who they were really called to be. The ark became a place of resurrection. So even if this is a story of hope, how does it apply to our situation? I mean, this is an ancient story in an ancient text, and our problems are different, aren't they? Well, it's become depressingly common for writers to naively assert that biblical writers had nothing like our current climate catastrophe in mind as they were formulating the text. I suggest, however, that the story of the flood, and there are other stories as well in the Hebrew Bible, that this story has significant similarities to our current context. This is a story that arose out of grief over the violence done on the earth by a culture that valued powerful men who were oppressive towards women and committed violence against them. This is a culture that valorized the warlords and the conquerors, a culture that privileged war over peace. It was, in short, a culture that might sound familiar, very like our own, where domination, oppression, and military might are powerful contributing forces to environmental degradation. And this is also a story about the possibility of complete environmental devastation, one that will irrevocably reshape life on Earth. This is also the sort of catastrophe we face today. But it's also a story with its threads of grace and hope, and that raises the question for some of whether God is going to rescue us out of a ruined creation, or let it unfold because of our actions. I wish I could say this was actually still the question for many people, but increasingly it isn't. Increasingly, we're facing our current crisis with an overwhelming sense of doom. All you have to do is talk to the children. But perhaps the question of whether God's going to rescue us is the wrong question. Perhaps the question is, where do we see grace and hope embedded in this story and our story? I mean, we've noted that grace and hope are rooted in this story right from the start. This is not unique to the Noah narrative. I mean, the biblical story is one where repeatedly the story goes to the darkest places and the most terrible situations that human beings can experience, right? Right at the beginning, you have one brother killing another brother, Cain and Abel. You have slaves that are sexually abused from their masters and then beaten. That's Hagar. You have dysfunctional families that sell one of the kids into slavery, Joseph. You have a whole people enslaved and their children thrown into a river in Exodus. You have kings raping the wives of their soldiers and then killing the soldiers so they don't find out, David and Bathsheba. You have people's land getting killed so their land can get taken, Naboth. You have species extinction in Hosea 4, injustice, peoples being conquered and taken to other lands in the exile, young people taken away from their lands, forbidden to speak their language, given different food and different names in Daniel. It always sounds like the residential school system to me. You have people oppressed by occupying forces and death on a Roman cross. And nonetheless, in all of these situations, the story describes how God creates the possibility of grace, of healing, of hope, of restoration, of new life. This is the specialty of the Creator God, bringing life where it appears that only violence and death can flourish. There is always a new thing for God's people to take hold of in the midst of judgment. Always there is resurrection. But this doesn't mean that judgment won't continue to unfold. So, what does it mean for those with eyes to see where the places of possible resurrection can happen? And let me be clear, I'm not looking for some cheap and facile hope here. The mourning of God in the face of what is happening to the earth, the mourning and anxiety that we experience, the mourning and anxiety, the lament of the earth itself, that's all deep and visceral. The deep trauma experienced by God in the flood, the deep trauma experienced by Noah's family, the deep trauma experienced by the earth, that trauma is far-reaching and generational, as it is in our own day. And how could it be otherwise? There's no way that this level of violence and destruction could ever end without trauma and grief. But that's never the only end for the story. In the Noah story of the flood, that place of grace, of resurrection, was the ark. In this story of climate catastrophe, the place of grace was a family that chose to be faithful to God's command to create a safe home for other creatures, to quite literally weather the storm at what would be great personal cost to themselves. So what if we were to take that calling quite literally? What if at a basic level we were to look around our watershed, our places, and ask what it would look like to create those places where biodiversity can flourish, those places where, in the face of impending heat waves, drought, flooding, fire, some species might be able to flourish. The implications of this would be far-reaching. In the first place, This would mean, like those in the ark, becoming an apprentice to our place. It would mean going back to our calling, our first calling as Adam, earth creatures, and paying attention, observing the watershed where we find ourselves, urban, suburban, or rural, and doing the careful, attentive work of discovering what creatures live there now, what used to live there, and what can we do to ensure that they can flourish there once again. And a significant movement has already begun at a grassroots level for people to begin this work in their personal lives. From pollinator gardens in city lots, to replacing front yards with plants, to interplanting vegetables with flowers for pollinators, people are realizing the importance of creating habitat for our insects and birds. It's happening everywhere. And this alone means that our urban centers are becoming places where insects are better able to thrive than in rural areas. Because in rural areas, industrial agriculture has aggressively destroyed native wetlands, forests, and meadows where the pollinators thrive. I see this every day when I leave my farm. Such actions, however, tend to be scattered and personal. So what if we worked not just in our small spaces, but mobilized for a vision where our whole city was an ark? There are larger cities around the world beginning to do just that. They're beginning to ask what it might look like to mitigate the coming destruction for insects and animals and for people. So the city of Medellin in Colombia of all places, green corridors have been created along the waterways and the highways to mitigate the effects of rising temperatures in the city, with an emphasis on those neighborhoods that have historically had less tree cover. And this vision has not only lowered the risk of exposure and death in extreme heat events, but it has also increased biodiversity in the city, gotten people outside, connected people to their watersheds. Not just Colombia, in Tucson, Arizona, a city in the hottest part of the U.S., the realization that water depletion would threaten the livelihood of the city has led to a series of interventions for water management that have created neighborhoods that are thriving green landscapes with trees and shrubs and food plantings in the desert, thereby reducing the need for water as well as lowering the temperature. And in Tucson, this was initiated by a guy named Brad Lancaster, who initially got fined by the city for cutting out the edges of his sidewalks so water could drain onto his land instead of into the sewers. Now they've changed the laws and the whole city's doing it. And LA is following their example. These examples demonstrate that it is possible to create places that can provide mitigation in the face of increasing heat, increasing drought, and the loss of biodiversity as the planet collapses. One of the courses of action that the Noah story calls us to, therefore, is to look at our own communities, our own watersheds, and imagine healing and restoration for those places. But there's more to the story than the flood and the ark. And that's the context I sketched at the beginning, the bit that doesn't make it into the children's books about the flood, or the children's Bibles often. That link between violence and the destruction of the earth, the death that the warriors of old create in their wake. Now, this link is easily seen in the destruction of the land that war and violence create, from the damage to creation from bombing and shelling, to the deliberate destruction of olive groves, water sources, fields, and trees by enemy forces, as is happening in the West Bank. Syria, Palestine, the Sudan, the evidence is everywhere, the Ukraine. But there's also the violence that is necessary to create the weapons of war, the violence to the earth and her creatures in the oil fields and the fracking sites in mountaintop removal. Doing violence to creation is necessary to fuel war. It's necessary to fashion weapons, even before we get to the results of war. Violence from start to finish. So for anyone who takes seriously the grief of Creator God over the destruction of creation, the necessity of working for peace is of utmost importance. Peacemaking is an environmental issue. as is the necessity of reducing the need for violently removing oil and gas from the earth to fuel the rest of our lives. And thankfully, the move to electric vehicles, the move to heat pumps alongside furnaces. In Canada, you can't really get on with a heat pump. You always need a furnace for backup. The move to solar and wind are creating societal-wide shifts away from this particular violence in Canada and around the world. If only we were as motivated to work for an end to war, if only we were as motivated to hang up our bows whenever we saw a rainbow hanging in the sky as God is. Now, a lot more could be said about all of this if we had a few days at our disposal. So to conclude, let me say only this. There's a saying that your calling is where your deepest joy and the world's deepest need meets. So as you ponder the need for the places of resurrection, the need for increased biodiversity, for the ark places in the coming catastrophe, as you reflect on the need for an end to violence that war inflicts on the earth, and an end to the violence of resource extraction, ask yourself how your gifts can further this work. I mean, perhaps you hate to get your hands dirty. I don't get that, but I know there are people like that. But you love to organize. And the thought of galvanizing your community on these issues is really appealing. Or you have financial skills. Every organization that fundraises for peace or biodiversity needs a treasurer. Find one near you. Perhaps you like to write songs or do art, create music around these issues, and offer your pieces to your local groups. Write for your local paper. That's what I do where I live. I write for the local secular press around these issues because I know how to write. That's one thing I can do. Or perhaps you have an eye for design, which I do not have, and you can see shape and color and text. Offer to design garden beds, or small food forests and shelters for biodiversity. Perhaps you're a gardener and you love to plant. Create those designs in the earth of your city or village. Perhaps you use your gifts in your faith community. Well, then write prayers for peace or create liturgy that is deeply rooted in your place. Find that thread of peace in the biblical story and highlight it in your sermons. Perhaps you're a builder who can build the raised garden beds for folks who need them. Or perhaps you're great at making videos and can document all of this work that people are doing. The options are endless once you find the communities where hope is being nourished, and increasingly they are everywhere. Sadly, not always in our churches. Ask what your gift is. Explore where it fits in the healing work. And better yet, gather your closest friends, because this work is always done better in community. Now, the flood story is just part of the story of the Creator's grief over the violence of the earth. It's just part of the story of the Creator's longing to ensure that life for creation continues when we have created death. In our own time, we are called to share that grief and enter into the resurrection story so that our longing for the renewal of the earth shapes all that we do.
Thank you, Sylvia, for those stimulating and challenging and encouraging words. It was a real delight. The idea now with the panel is to create some dialogue around what Sylvia has thrown out for us. And we're blessed with a wonderful panel. And I will introduce them and we'll get on with it. So first, Dr. Gerda Kits, who is with the King's University, is an ecological economist who teaches at King's. She's also a volunteer researcher with Research for the Front Lines, an organization that supports communities fighting for environment and climate justice. I'll introduce all three of them and they'll come up and then we'll start off. Secondly, Jonathan Crane. Reverend Crane is a locally focused small church Anglican pastor, a mouthful, family man, and substance permaculture gardener in East Edmonton. Thank you for being here. And Céline Chuang is a designer, artist, writer, and facilitator working at the intersections of contemplative justice, place, land, and memory. Her writing has appeared in places like the I'm going to blow this. I won't even try. Another magazine, Guts, G's Magazine, and the anthology A Liturgy for All Bodies, New Words for a New World. She shares life with her partner, Benjamin, with whom she runs a used bookstore, an unruly garden, various fermentation experiments, which we can hear more about, and an aggressively cuddly bear-sized dog. All right, so maybe we'll come up, and what we'll have is each of the three will respond for about 5 minutes each to what Sylvia has said, and then maybe we'll give Sylvia a few minutes to respond to what you've said, and then we'll have the panel maybe engage in some conversation with Sylvia then. So come on up.
I'm not Gerda. I'm Céline, but I'll be going next. Yes, thank you, Sylvia, for the powerful and wonderful presentation full of beautiful images and sensory details, and to the Micah Centre for hosting this talk. I'm honored to be here and to be in conversation with you all. I've been thinking a lot about lament and about grief. Not just thinking, holding it. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, you can move it. Not just thinking about grief and lament, but holding it in my body. Feeling its heaviness in my belly like a stone. I keep returning to what Jesus said, even the stones will cry out. Jesus spoke these words upon his raucous, jubilant entry into Jerusalem, when the people came together to chant dangerous words that the powerful wanted to keep silent. Not so different from a protest, and maybe it was one. Even the stones will cry out. I think about what grief the stones in Gaza feel, how the rubble of ruined homes might howl, and the ashes of olive trees and beehives burned, wafts and wails from river to sea. To me, the land lamenting in Palestine echoes the Romans passage that Sylvia framed for us. That of creation groaning under imperial extraction, exploitation, and occupation. Empire then, empire now. The land does not forget, and the land, along with the people, is getting louder. How then can we listen? I want to pull out a thread from Sylvia's presentation and speak more about situating climate catastrophe within a wide scope of vision. We witness the ongoing genocide in Gaza as not just the attempted destruction of a people, but of creatures, plants, trees, ecosystems, and lifeways. Here on Turtle Island, where we live, we need only look back at our own history to see how the powers and principalities, what Miriam Kaba calls death-dealing systems, colonialism, capitalism, and white supremacy, collude and collide for more than 150 years of Indigenous dispossession. Built on a foundation of enslavement, indentured labor, and racist immigration controls, the nation-state we today call Canada exists in opposition to the life and flourishing of the land and its original inhabitants. To cite Métis writer Chelsea Ball, while fears of climate apocalypse loom only recently in the public imagination, Indigenous people in so-called Canada have been living in a post-apocalyptic reality since first contact. So I ask then, what does it mean to take up the call from Demian Denizyahi to betray the idea of our country. We might start with cultivating suspicion of the state and a willingness to transgress, i.e. break the law, which can be, as Sylvia pointed out, an integral part of mischief-making and sacred solidarity with the living world. We might also resist a universalizing rhetoric that paints the climate crisis as a collective human failing, and in doing so, absolves responsibility for the systems that led us here and continue to deal death, disproportionately to those that are Black, brown, Indigenous, poor, and from the global South. As an alternative to the Anthropocene, as a term describing our current epoch of mass extinction, anthro meaning human, Randy Woodley has proposed Eurocene to account for the world-ending impacts of European colonization, while Anna Singh's plantation scene points to the combination of slave labor, the plantation system, and corporate capitalism. So if we see the struggle to restore our ravaged earth as linked to other struggles for justice and liberation, a spiritual as well as material calling, we can only cast out a demon, as Dorothy Soel preaches, by calling it by its name. Earlier, I invoked the word apocalypse. And if you were triggered by that, or like me, you were raised on bad Revelation fan fiction, just stay with me. The gospel of apocalypse is the wild rose, yarrow, and Saskatoon growing amidst the rubble. It's the mutual aid of the mycelium, metabolizing toxic waste from the earth and sharing nutrients with the forest. One might even say it's the mustard seed, spreading a wild and flowering kinship in defiance to the borders of empire. What has lived through apocalypse can teach us how to live now. Just as Sylvia spoke of how ecological grief for Black and Indigenous people is intergenerational, so too are forms of survival and resistance. And for me, one of these lessons is to be loud with lament. What I mean is to do something with the grief that bubbles up inside of us. Alchemize your anger into art, cry out with the stones, howl and wail and dance. As Sylvia invited us, find your place in the revolution. Or as the age-old protest chant goes, mourn the dead, fight like hell for the living. I'll return to Mariame Kaba, who I quoted earlier, a Black feminist and prison abolitionist whose words on hope I find instructive. She says, hope is a discipline. Hope is a discipline. I read this as hope being a practice. Hope is embodied acts of making other worlds possible. Hope does not depend on feeling. Hope is a muscle to be stretched and used alongside grief. It's saving seeds as portals to the past and the future. It's burying garlic in the fall and trusting in some coming spring. Sylvia spoke of Noah's family practicing stubborn hope in the face of destruction, and the everyday acts of service and care required to keep themselves and others around them alive. This, I think, is an example of what Kaba is inviting us to. A hope that is not despite the scale of destruction, but is enacted amidst the trouble in order to create new worlds from within the ruins of the old. You know the old saying, where there's life, there's hope. The truth is that more and more we know that life is persistent and endlessly interconnected. Recently, I was here at King's and I was listening to Dr. Amina El-Atis Bradford at the Interdisciplinary Studies Conference. And she described God as the original symbiotic event. She suggested that to say yes to the image of God is to say yes to our creatureliness, yes to our interdependence. So my invitation to you today is to say yes in your slowing down, in your bending and attending to the land, and being attended to by the land. Lament loudly. Take heart and practice hope from a place of entanglement with life. And act, as Joanna Macy puts it, in league with the stones and the beasts and the beings of the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that talk, Sylvia, and also for your response, Céline. I think some of what I'm going to say will resonate with what you've said. So I heard resonance in your talk with the work that reconnects by Joanna Macy, which, for anyone who hasn't heard of, is a series of practices that are meant to help people deal with ecological grief. And that's something that I've drawn on while I try to figure out how to teach my students about climate change in a way that is still hopeful. And one of the things that Joanna Macy says is that there is value just in naming the big, scary things that are facing us. In my line of work as an economist, we tend to go straight to like the practical solutions, technological innovations, and so on. And I think there is great value in just putting words to the emotions that we feel around climate change and just sitting with that for a while. And so thanks for the opportunity that you gave us to do that tonight. And of course, the reminder of hope is timely. Again, in my discipline, there is a lot of focus on human solutions to climate change. And so when we see those solutions failing again and again, that can be very scary. And so it's good to be reminded that even though we're called to participate in this work, we're not ultimately the ones in charge of the outcome. Now, there are two things that I struggle with in the story of Noah, and I'm going to name them not with the intention of pushing back on anything you've said, but just in hopes that we can wrestle with them together. One is that the specific work that I do brings me into relationship with three groups of people who are both least responsible for and most affected by climate change. So one is communities in the Global South. And I've been volunteering for a long time with World Renew, which is a Christian relief and development organization that many of you are familiar with. And back when in North America, say a decade or so ago, we were still talking about climate change as something that we would likely see in the future. Communities in the Global South were already experiencing it as a present reality. Communities that World Renew was working with were telling us that the rains were coming late, or early, or not at all, or they were coming in the form of torrential downpours that were washing away their seeds. So they were and are already going hungry because of climate change. And those are, of course, the communities that are least responsible for causing climate change. The second group of people that I work with is Indigenous communities. And I've been working with Indigenous climate action on a project called Decolonizing Climate Policy, and they've just released a report on that project. ICA did a survey a couple of years ago that asked folks from Indigenous communities in Canada about their experiences of climate change. And what we heard was that those communities are being displaced by floods. They're losing access to traditional lands because of wildfires. They're losing the ability to harvest and grow traditional foods. They are communities that are very much on the front lines of standing up to protect the earth, but are also experiencing some of the worst impacts of climate change. And the third group is young people, the students that I teach every day. I hear so much heaviness and despair from them when we talk about climate change. They care about the world so much. They want to make a difference. They're attending climate marches, but they're also so aware that they are inheriting a world that is in very rough shape, and they just don't have much hope that they can change things. So when I think about those three groups in relation to the story of Noah, in one sense, they are in the place of Noah because they are standing up to protect the earth. They are stewarding the land. They are speaking up for change. But in another sense, they are not Noah because they're not in the ark. They are not shielded from the impacts of climate change like many of us in this room are. Instead, they're standing outside the ark with the waters rising around them. And so I wonder where in the Noah story or elsewhere in Scripture we might find hope that speaks to the situations of people in those groups. And the other thing I wrestle with in this story is that Western, predominantly white countries, groups, churches often see themselves in the place of Noah in ways that are very unhealthy. We tend to see ourselves as the ones with the answers, the ones who need to be in charge because we're the ones that know how to fix things. I've actually never much liked Noah, and this is not from the text. This is me reading my own insecurities into it. But I tend to see him on the ark, looking down at all those who are drowning and saying, look what you guys got yourselves into. And so how can we be Noahs who do the good work of stewarding and renewing and protecting and caring, while guarding against that tendency to self-satisfaction and paternalism and feeling like we're the ones with all the answers?
We've heard some beautiful words tonight. I'm really grateful for them. And a theme that I hear rising up that resonates with me is sitting with the grief that is there. I'm drawn to the contemplative themes in our Christian history and practice, and dear to me in that, and fitting with my personality and what I like to be about, is not moving too quickly to action, but just being in it. And I'm grateful to find some colleagues in that way as well. I've been married 20 years, and when I was courting my wife, I would drive from the west end of Edmonton through to her house in Sherwood Park, and it was 26 minutes. And I did that for lots of time, and since marriage, that same route over and over and over. There's one section that also has a graveyard that I've been to a number of times as a pastor, and burials and all the rest of it. So I guess it was already a place of grief for me. And this past year, there was an occurrence on the corner of that street just before getting to my wife's family house. There was a small enclave of trees that went down into a ravine and a wetland that traveled through the area. And it disappeared this year after all those years. And I was struck by the grief that held me for that little bit of trees. And it's now flat, and I think there's a whole strip of businesses and good things, housing, shops that I'll probably go shop at. But that little bit of trees that disappeared, and I was left wondering, how did we make that decision to say what we're going to put there is more important than that little ecosystem? And thinking about tonight of that moment of decision that comes to us, and as was mentioned, it's often out of our control. There were decisions made that this road, this infrastructure was more important than the wildflowers that were there. There was a decision made that was outside of our control, that it was better to ship this air fryer from over here and then back to be made, and then over here to come to the consumer. And those decisions were out of our control. The decisions of so much of our life that have been beyond us, and thinking of those individuals who have had such control over the shape of our society and life, and have said, yes, the road is more important than the wildflower. These shops are more important than the trees. I live on an old dairy farm, and so there are multiple decisions of This dairy farm is more important than the ecosystem that was there. These houses are more important than the dairy farm. And I mean, we all benefit from all these decisions that have gone in. We are, I think, mostly church people. And it was an Indigenous voice that reminded me how much ceremony we carry. And how many, I mean, that's my entire life as a pastor, is ceremonies in all their different shapes. And we have ceremonies of grief. We have ceremonies to help people sit in these places that are so difficult and that have been so beautifully opened up for us tonight. And I wonder, how could we open those ceremonies up in a deeper ecological way? What would it be like for all the church people to go to that corner in Sherwood Park and somehow grieve the trees, whether the businesses are still there? What would it be like for us to go and sit by the road and grieve the wildflower and bring our ceremonies and all the teachings that we carry into these places? One delightful thing, I don't know if you know Sylvia, there's a lady, Mary Reynolds, in Ireland, who has started, do you know her? I've heard of her. So she has an initiative called that we all build arcs, so acts of restorative kindness, which I thought was a delightful piece, which I think is to take of all the owned land to rewild half of it in the world. And so the themes you're picking up on are important for us to be sitting in and taking action on. So thank you.
We'll have the panel come up front now. Did you want to say something?
No, I was just going to hand the mic.
Panel come up, and we'll give Sylvia an opportunity to respond to some of the things that were said, and then you should feel free to respond to Sylvia right away if you like.
Okay, thank you for these responses. It's always nice to hear the diverse responses that a panel comes up with in relation to what I was saying. Céline, I think all I really want to say to what you said is amen. This is I loved how you emphasized the the importance of talking about not the Anthropocene, as if all people are equally responsible for what's been going on in terms of the world, but these alternative ways of describing that as the Eurocene or the plantation scene. I've heard somebody also call it the capitalocene, as if capitalism is the problem. I think it really is important for us to talk about repentance as well. So that grief that we have, the complicity that we have, should lead to some kind should lead to repentance as we think about what we in our society, in sort of a wealthy country, and particularly European society in North America, what how complicit we are in what's been happening to the climate in the climate crisis. Your words also reminded me of Black farmer and activist Leah Penniman, who talks about how there are four wings of a butterfly in thinking about how we respond to the climate crisis that we're facing, and we need all four wings. So there are activists and healers and dreamers and builders, she says, and we need to figure out where we fit in making this whole project for healing work. So thank you very much. That's great. Gerda, you had two very good questions that I'd like to respond to. The question of, that we're not in the ark. We're standing outside of the ark with the waters rising around us. And where in the biblical story do we find people in that situation? And so let me say that this, what I presented tonight, is part of the second chapter of a book I'm writing on climate grief and biblical hope. So I think that Noah and his family actually were part of being outside of the ark at first. I mean, when the text talks about the violence that was being done on the earth, also what's going on in that, behind that story is, Noah and his family, his wife and his kids and their wives, seeing the ruin and destruction that's happening. So the ruin and destruction we're seeing is ruin and destruction they were seeing as well. So when they got to that point where God said, "This is it, I'm wiping everything away," I sort of wonder, what was the response? Were they also thinking, thank God, I guess literally, something's going to be done to end this violence? Was there also hope for a new future, or, so was that tied in with the grief? But also, to your point, in later chapters of the book, I explore other places in the biblical story, in the book of Jeremiah, for instance, where you have people in the midst of the devastation of the Babylonian destruction of the land. Those are people who are in the midst of this apocalyptic scenario. And the book deals with what they're experiencing. So I think there are places in the biblical text. The first century, when Jesus was alive and when Paul was writing, also they were in the midst of a very broad environmental destruction going on. So there are biblical resources and in those contexts I talk precisely about colonization, what Indigenous peoples have been experiencing, and others, people in the Black community, the Asian community, people who have been dispossessed on our land. So those resources are there, but there's going to be a whole book, so won't go into that too much now. And also that question, we tend to see ourselves as the one who do the saving, and how can we guard against self-satisfaction and paternalism, as if we have all the answers. And I think that all of that coming from a place of deep grief and lament helps to guard against that. I mean, we do this work from a place of sorrow, not only sorrow about what is happening to the earth and to our community, so entering into the sorrow of other creatures and creation. And it's very hard to be paternalistic if you're the sorrow of other people, if you're walking with the oppressed, as Paul puts it in Romans 12. So I think that's part of the answer. But, people who read the Bible have a savior complex, so that's always a bit of a challenge, especially white people who read the Bible. Jonathan, I really liked your emphasis on the ceremonies of grief, and how can we shape ceremonies of grief, practices for grief that help us to hold our grief, to express it, not necessarily to get over it. I think actually grief and lament are where we need to be for a while, I think, and ceremony helps us. I've heard this in relation to the sweat lodge. The preparations you do for the sweat lodge helps you hold the poison that comes out while you're in the sweat lodge, right? So how can we hold the poison, hold the grief, so that healing can eventually come, but not be cheap about that? And I think ceremony can really help us do that, also so that we can share our grief with others. So today in my family, 6 years ago in Walsh, Saskatchewan, a young man shot a number of teachers and his cousins. One of the teachers was a young man who lived on our farm for a year, Adam. whose name is, his last name's just disappeared out of my mind for something. I'm a little tired. I spent a bit of time on the phone with my youngest today, who was 16 at the time Adam lived on our farm for a summer, and who's had PTSD since that shooting. And as I've been working on grief, I've realized that when the anniversary of Adam's death comes along, Adam Wood was his name, and she called him, my youngest called him a mud man because the name Adam means earth creature, from the earth, of the mud. I spend a lot of time just sort of listening to grief today and being there, just because I realized when this first happened, I tried to talk the grief away. And I think that actually made the resultant PTSD worse. So part of ceremony is being there with each other to just acknowledge and hold it together. You mentioned Mary Reynolds and talking about if we took half our land and made pollinator places. If you haven't read Douglas Tallamy yet, anybody, he also talks about homegrown national park. Just take half of whatever land you have and rewild it. If everybody did that, we'd have no trouble with biodiversity again. So I think that's a powerful vision, actually. So thank you all very much.
Thanks, Sylvia. Look it up. No, is it working now?
Nope.
How about now?
Yeah.
Do any of you want to respond to what Sylvia just said? She's made comments on your points. Would you like to? No. All right. I'll throw something out. I've experienced, I must admit, a fair amount of climate grief, and I've also, I think I've gone through moments of despair with climate, species extinction, watching how society works, studying the oil sands. All of this has, I think, had many negative. So it's been very difficult, and I really, really appreciate what you said. But I'm going to ask a hard question. Maybe you've answered this, but so you're a theologian, and you say God will not destroy the earth again. He covenanted not to destroy the earth again after the Noah event, right? After the flood. And how does it help to say God will not destroy the earth again, and we look around ourselves and people are destroying it, and God is letting us destroy the earth? That sort of eats away at me. So how do you respond to that, or how does any of the panelists respond to that?
I'll start. I know what you mean about experiencing that grief. That's why I started working on all of this. When I wrote our book, Romans Disarmed, chapter 5 is a lament for the land. And that grew out of a trip I took up to the oil sands with the Anglican Church Justice Camp, which is my denomination now. And a friend of mine said that, who had been on the delegation, said to me, she said, I don't know if you remember, but we didn't talk the whole way back to Edmonton. We sat in that van and we didn't say a word, she said, and I never heard you speak about it until I read what you wrote in the book. It took me a couple of years to process it. When I think about this promise that God made, when I kind of went through and said, look, all these things happen in the story, and yet there's always this will for God to bring resurrection in these darkest places. I have no idea what that will look like in our situation. I don't. I do know that after Jesus died on that cross, those disciples thought it had all ended. Nothing more was possible. And then who would have thought that resurrection was on the cards? And there's a British mythologist, storyteller, Martin Shaw, who says when we just go to those places of despair, we close down on what possibility could look like, and that we need to keep the door open on possibility, because otherwise we assume we know the future, And, we've created it and we know what it will be like. And he says there's a profound arrogance in that. That possibility, there must be possibility for new life out there. We don't know what it will look like. But let me put it this way. Another way to put it is, when I read the biblical story and I'm reading the book of Revelation, and it's got this picture of the new heaven and the new earth, this incredibly attractive vision of this city that's got a river running through it and trees on both sides of the river with the fruit in their seasons every 12 months. It's like this permaculture food forest city. It's like a dream. And I think about that vision and think, okay, I don't know how we're going to get there. I don't know how God's going to implement this vision, but this really is the ending of the story that I'm living into. I so deeply long for this vision to be true that I'm going to live as if it will be true, as if it can come true, because the only other option is living into a vision of the future that is deathly. And there's no way I can bring myself to live as if that vision is true. So, damn it, I'm just going to hook my wagon to this story and off we go. On a very practical level, trying to believe that story is true happens when I go outside and I go down to where things are blooming and I start poking around and, man, there's the tricolored bumblebee again. And it's like, who on earth invented this? This is a God with a vision for beauty and diversity and life, as you talked about, just coming up, welling up from the deepest places. And that's sort of what kind of keeps me going, especially as I've spent my whole day writing a book on climate grief.
Because we're on the panel, so we had to respond to your talk. But there's part of me that feels that the talk about tomato seedlings would be more important, in the sense that we interpret the scriptures, but a tomato has its own interpretation intrinsically there, and there's a way that we need to bring back to our not interpreting the tomato through the scriptures, but interpreting the scriptures through the tomato. What I mean by that is just what you said, that when we're in the garden, we discover that nothing is lost. And I don't think I understood death until I did composting, and to see that everything is renewed. And I don't know if humanity is part of God's plan long term, but I'm confident because of the garden that life will always be there, and we can't stop it. And I think COVID, that moment where like the waterways in Venice, like opened up and the dolphins came back so quick, was like, whoa, life knows what it's doing. And I don't know if we'll be around, but I heard someone say, I'm betting on the raccoons. They're going to take over, but life will be there. I think is the tomato teaching that I hold on to. Yeah.
I think that also, is this one working? There.
Just keep talking.
Keep talking? Okay. The light went on and then it went off. I think that also connects with what you were talking in your talk when you were saying, like, to find our niche, right? What's our specific role to play? I think as an academic, for sure, I sort of feel the pressure to have all the answers, right? And this also gets back to my question about how do we not see ourselves as, the ones who have to fix everything. And so finding our piece of it, I think, is really important. And for me, for sure, has been a way that I've been able to find some hope, to live into hope. There are specific things that I know I can do. I can code an interview transcript. And that doesn't sound all that inspiring, but it's a piece that I can do. And then it's part of that radical trust that we have to trust that will be a piece of the final, right? And even if we can't see how that is going to happen right now.
Yep.
Yes? Okay, I'll just keep talking and then you let me know if you can hear me. I guess I just wanted to go back to something you said. You brought up Jesus' execution and how that was like the lowest, like the most intense moment of despair in the story, right? And when you brought that up, I thought immediately of the women that go, thinking he's dead, like prepared with ritual, with ceremony, right? Like that was in a way an act of hope, even though they didn't know what would happen, because it created. Who said this? One of you said this, like the possibility for life, just because they showed up and to witness that. So I guess I just want to like pull that thread out again and say like often we don't know the end of the story will be, and the end maybe the multiple possible ending. But doing those ceremonies of hope, those acts of hope, those acts of togetherness and of cultural and ancestral wisdom, like those in a way create the possibility of what life can happen, right? And yeah, the radical trust of that, I think, is important today.
Another quick question. Most of us are parts of churches on some level or another, and there are things being done. There's a committee here and a committee there. Kairos does some really excellent work, but it's shockingly little that the churches are doing. You rarely hear sermons on climate and creation care, and all sorts of structural activities that churches should and could do on this. Just doesn't seem to happen. So you have this powerful message from the Noah story and God's grieving and the earth lament. And what needs to be done to wake up the church to the urgency of the moment? For all four of you, like what really needs to be done? We'll start with Sylvia and then move down.
I think if we could repent of our heresy that we're all going to heaven, that would be a start. Really, this idea that what is important is our inner spiritual life is more important than what's happening in creation. The idea that, our souls need to be saved more than healing needs to come to the earth. I think we read the Bible as if it's a book about our individual relationship with God, and that's not what it's about, right? This is about, the biblical story is about God creating this incredible, diverse, and beautiful creation, and God wanting to come and live in a food forest along a river with a whole bunch of incredible creatures and a couple of naked vegetarians. And the whole story, later meat came into the picture, but the whole story is about God trying to shape a community where God can once again dwell on earth in a healed creation with all creatures and humanity once again. And that's what we get in the book of Revelation, right? At the end, it ends with new creation. So for starters, sometimes we need pastoral sermons about our own individual needs. We needed a bunch of those during COVID. But, that's a big problem. Our preaching is individually focused rather than on this larger vision of healing for all of creation. The story's about God bringing healing to creation and to the community of people that live on creation. So that's, for starters, our preaching needs to change, definitely. That's one thing. For the rest, it's really hard. I was co-chair of the Bishop's Committee for Creation Care in the Diocese of Toronto, and I finally quit because it was like banging my head against a wall, it felt like. And I was supposedly the bishop's appointee to kind of lead on this, but churches have so much land that could be used for food and pollinators. Churches have the ability to organize in ways that other community groups don't, except they're losing that, I think. So I just, there's lots of things churches could be doing with the land that they have and leadership they're providing. But again, I think we're just out of step there's a lot of initiatives going on in our wider society, but I think we should probably just try to get on board with at this point. That's not a very hopeful vision of the church, but I think the reality is churches aren't that powerful in our society anymore. Like, we don't have that much sway or influence anymore. And there's other people other groups carrying us forward. But maybe somebody else has a more hopeful thing to say. Nobody does about that. I don't know. Maybe we should be starting more forest churches and wild churches and farm churches and, garden churches. That might be a step, I think, too.
Okay. Is it on? Yeah. Oh, this one feels louder. So as Sylvia spoke to, I think in my experience, a lot of churches are just too bound up and enmeshed in some of those death-dealing systems that I mentioned earlier, in terms of the theology, the economics of them. And that's not the case for, of course, every single church, but that's just what I've experienced. And there are communities that I guess are church-like. One of them that a friend of mine and a pastor, Laurel Dykstra, runs is called Salal and Cedar, and they meet outside. And I think that would be one place to start, is holding these ceremonies, holding liturgies on the land and learning from it and listening to it. One thing they do at Salal and Cedar is to have the Stations of the Cross outside, and on the mountain, on Burnaby Mountain, I think. And to me, that could be one place where churches could go, is to get outside and pay attention and Sylvia mentioned earlier, like a posture of humility, I think, and listening. But for myself, I look to the margins of the Christian tradition, and that's where I find the prophetic voices that speak to me, liberation theologies, and voices that are often not heard in the mainstream. And I feel like I've been uncovering those voices and kind of finding them over, the past, 20 years or something like that. And it's unfortunately not it was something that I kind of had to tackle on my own or with a few other people. It wasn't something that was encouraged or brought into church spaces. So maybe more groups like that need to happen, reading groups or just communities of practice, communities of questioning. Maybe that's what church could look like.
Anyone else? Jonathan?
Sure. I've got lots to say about this. And I think we're in a story which has to do with Christendom and the Enlightenment, that our faith has been focused on belief as a mental aspect. And so our preaching has been very intellectually focused, and we've just kind of stumbled into that. And then Christendom being that we've been in places of power, and so it's just we haven't really worried about our place in society, and we maybe got into some moral stuff, about kind of judging other people mostly, and thinking that was the right godly way to be. But we're out of that now. Christendom is dead. The Enlightenment is over. And we're in that funny zone, like awkward teenagers, not sure what our strengths are yet, and trying things out awkwardly or just hiding in the corner, not sure what to do. And recovering, I think, some, like Jesus says, reaching back for things that are old and new. letting those come together. So there's a lot of reclaiming. And one piece that we weren't able to exist in Christendom is that prophetic piece of really giving voice to the kingdom of God in a concrete way, in a concrete place, with concrete people, to reveal something that would not be seen otherwise. And there was a line that I was drawn to in your talk. It was something about improbable and impossible, an improbable and impossible task. And for me, that's where the church is being called to live, actually, that we actually get a kick in the pants from all the other groups that are doing a way better job at ecological work than we are, and remember that we're called to be leaders in that. And so how can we actually be on the improbable and impossible task list to help what is being revealed take shape in the reality of our place? And yeah, I think it moves us into humility of, who are we? We've not been doing this. Other groups are way ahead from us. Permaculture focuses on the edges, that like the highest biodiversity in nature happens like where a stream hits the land, or a field hits the forest. And so those places of creativity that we listen to those who are outside the church, listen to parts of ourselves that we haven't given voice to before, to let that creativity kind of, that's a redemptive story that we hadn't thought about before. And how can we, I think you also said, kind of looking for all the places of resurrection. It's like we've lost our eyes to see that. And so, yeah, I think it takes community and courage and being playful, I think, is my biggest thought. How can we be playful, and like, what would it be like to take that place in society and step out and be in the front and solar panel our roofs and rewild our land? And we're doing a bit of that at St. Augustine's, which is pretty fun with the community. So yeah, it's good.
Maybe you can share with us how that's done with our church. Come on over and put solar panels on our church.
Yeah.
The time is a bit after 9, right? Do we have time for a bit more, or?
Time to say thanks.
It's not time to say thanks. Yeah, can we take 1 or 2 audience questions and then quit? Or is that too long? We do need to stop on time.
I think just if there's a parting word that the panelists have for us, that might be
Okay, we'll start again with Jonathan and work this way. And a final word, parting word, a challenge, a hope, a prayer. Sylvia too.
I don't have much to say, but gratitude for the night and how I began. A lot of beautiful words. I've appreciated even just the turns of phrases that kind of invite us into a space that can be difficult to live in. And it takes a community sitting together to kind of, okay, we can do this. We can get through it. Thank you.
I think, one of the things that I just love about evenings like this is hearing the different perspectives, the diversity of perspectives that make you think about things in ways you hadn't before, but also give you hope in ways that you didn't have before. So thank you for that.
Maybe I'll just say I had a point that didn't make it into my allotted 5 minutes, but I think for me a source of hope is lineage, is looking back to see those marginal voices, as I mentioned, but also just people who have helped us get where we are here in terms of the journey towards justice and liberation and that work. And I think you can draw a lot of creativity and even joy and energy and life and playfulness and wisdom from looking back and knowing this tradition. So that would be my final encouragement, is to take what you've heard and then explore who else has done that, who else has written about that, who else has made art about it, and let that be something that nourishes you.
I guess I would want to say two things. One, if you can apprentice yourself to the earth, start with growing tomatoes. Start with growing something, and think about resurrection as the season ends, because that's the one constant in the universe, is that every year resurrection happens again. The other would be, if you're part of a Bible study group, I hate to say this, put down the Bible and turn that into a creation study group that starts to think about it. Until we start thinking in community with the same fervor we've been reading the biblical text, or read the biblical text through the eyes of creation, I think that will be crucial to learning what it is to live in the world. And Paul says this in Romans, right? That we learn everything we need to know about God from nature, from creation. So I think we should take that a little more seriously. Thanks. And this was a wonderful evening. Thanks for organizing it, Jonathan.
And thank you all for coming and for sharing this time with us. We hope good seeds are planted and that your activities are fertilized with good compost. That I can't think of a more urgent thing to be contemplating and a more stimulating way to do it with the panel and Celia. So thank you very much, and thank you for coming.